Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Eric Olander. Today, the fallout from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos is still reverberating. If you recall, he declared that the old U.S.-led international order is dead and called for middle power states to work together to form a new coalition. Not surprisingly, his remarks were not well received in the United States, but it sparked a lot of conversation in wealthier middle power countries like Germany, Australia, South Korea, France, and others. And we're reading a lot about that right now in international media coverage. But we haven't heard much at all, though, about what all this means in smaller, lesser developed countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The dynamics are very different, and oftentimes because they are much more vulnerable due to their size. Oftentimes it's poverty or weak governance that are factors that play into all of this. So we're going to focus on a fascinating report that came out last October, focusing on how small states in South Asia are navigating this new multipolar world that we're in. Now, what's interesting is that the dynamics of what's happening over here in Asia are very similar in many ways to the challenges that smaller countries in other developing regions are also confronting. There's an opportunity here to apply learnings from one region to another, but of course, not in all cases, and there are a lot of differences. The report I mentioned looks beyond just the U.S.-China competition, but also includes India in the mix as well, and that's something important in certain parts of the world. I'm thrilled to have two of the lead authors of the report join me today for our discussion. Sagar Prasai is an independent advisor for international development agencies and joins us today from Kathmandu, Nepal. And Mandakini Surie is an independent consultant who spent more than 20 years doing development work for government, NGOs, and think tanks. Sagar and Mandakini, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to have you today, and what a great time to have this. When you wrote the report back in October, you could never have foreseen where we are today. And I guess before we get started looking into the report, I'd like to get both of your perspectives, both from India and from Nepal, on the Carney speech, and whether you think the message he signaled is as important where you are as it's being discussed in Europe and parts of industrial Asia. Sagar, let's start with you, and then Mandakini, I'd like to get your take on that.
Yeah, so it's like that moment when somebody suddenly screams from the sides, the emperor has no clothes, right? And so in that sense, the existence of the U.S. hegemony was well understood at all levels, at political levels, at sort of in financial domain and otherwise. And the average Nepali cannot buy or sell anything without first changing their currency into dollars. And so it's the presence of the dollar is quite overwhelming, everywhere. But for the immediate stakeholders, which is the foreign policy establishment in Nepal and those who keep track of the issues like these, it was like, well, we all knew, it's just that there is an open admission. And in that sense, even in that speech, the precursor was that, well, we all knew, but, at the same time, we never quite mentioned it or openly confronted the U.S. in this fashion. And so there was some, let's just say, a quiet celebration that the truth is out, right, from that angle. But for countries like Nepal, which is right in the middle of India and China, it's got only two neighbors, China to the north and India to the south. Both are emerging giants, disproportionately larger than what Nepal is. And so, therefore, it lived in a different geopolitical setting where U.S. mattered, of course, because it overwhelmingly matters everywhere. And to a certain extent, particularly as a sort of developing partners, and Europeans also mattered. But beyond that, Nepal has always a predominant concern about what happens in China and India rather than elsewhere.
Yeah. Mandakini, the India reaction has been very interesting in part because India has seen this dynamic play out before as well. India, during the Cold War, very skillfully played both sides. And so I'm wondering if the reaction in New Delhi was similar to what Sagar was hearing in Nepal.
Well, I think for one thing, I'm not sure that it actually made the frontline news. I think it was buried somewhere in the newspaper. And of course, I heard about it and was very curious to hear what he had said. And when I, heard it back, I was actually a little underwhelmed because underwhelmed in the sense that what he was saying was not really new. I think developing countries, middle income countries which are kind of, small island countries, have been talking about the structural inequalities that they have been seeing in these international processes, whether it's the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or on trade or financing for decades, and have been calling it out quite vociferously. And I think India has been one of those countries, South Africa, Brazil. The Prime Minister of Barbados, if nobody heard, is absolutely fabulous. I mean, I think she calls out
and hypocrisy she calls out.
She calls out the hypocrisy. I think what was interesting was the fact that, as Sagar said, for the first time you had a Western, democratic leader actually calling it out and saying that, the post-World War institutional structures, this rules-based international order that has been shoved down the throats of many countries is unfair in many ways, and that larger, more powerful, more financially powerful countries for years have been pursuing their own foreign policy or diplomatic, economic imperatives with a lot of impunity, and it's been the kind of hush-hush secret that everybody has kind of gone along with. So I think it was a bit of, I think that the reaction, just not only from India, but many countries in the global south was, well, we told you so. You just weren't paying attention until it's come to bite you and affect your country, right? So I think, for example, just to give an example, with the rise of China, because Sagar mentioned, the China has been concerns about China's expanding footprint across the world was such big news for the last decade. It led to the Indo-Pacific becoming a new geographic construct, the Quad alignment between India, USA, Japan, and Australia came as a result of that. All of it focused around very much controlling China's strategic rise. And in fact, even Canada came up with an Indo-Pacific strategy for China. And now you have Mark Carney saying, okay, we're willing to talk to China. So, I think India very much to go back to your point around the Cold War, which is, when you had the US-Russia, the tensions rising, particularly over the last couple of years, Trump wanted India to stop buying Russian oil. He still wants us to stop buying Russian oil. And I think India has been more muted about it now, but the foreign policy position was like, look, we're going to exercise our strategic autonomy and buy oil from where we can because we've got our economy needs to grow. And India has actually done a lot to respond to Trump's demands as well. But yet now we have some of the highest tariffs being imposed of all the countries in South Asia. So I think calling out that kind of double standard is something that countries have experienced for a long time. But now that it's coming to bite the West, I think there is more open acknowledgement of it.
Yeah, and he even acknowledged that they knew that this was a flawed system, but went along with it. Just very quickly before we get on, I mean, you were being very polite that it was saying it's from a wealthy or G7 country. Is it the fact that this is coming from a white man different? Because we don't, I mean, the whiteness matters here. And all
it does. I was wondering, should I say it or not? But yeah, it does matter.
No, that's good. Let's kind of be as direct as you can.
I mean, 100% it matters. I think you cannot, the fact that a person of, a white person who is, the leader of a G7 country saying, it's unfair and it's unfair to Canadian people. You're like, well, what about the millions of people south of the equator who've been saying it's been unfair for generations, So I think there is definitely a factor. And I suspect it would not have made such mainstream headline news had it not been a white leader who had said it.
Yeah. I mean, if Modi said it or if Modi or Xi said it, people would have been like, yeah.
Modi, Xi, the Prime Minister of Barbados, the BRICS countries, all of them, if you Google it, ChatGPT it, you will find statements from them going back decades, which would have said something to the effect that the existing world order is not fair.
Yeah. There's a similar phenomenon going on in the United States where, white people are shocked that the police are abusive and that even video, recordings of police brutality against white protesters in places like Minneapolis and killings now of white people And, brown and black people have been saying this for decades, for centuries, actually, that the police have been impartial. So again, this is a reckoning happening both inside and outside the U.S. As much as I'd like to continue that line of our conversation, I want to get back to the report that you guys worked on last year. Now, it focused on 3 countries in particular, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. You also had some insights included in it from Bhutan and Maldives as well. Sagar, let's talk a little bit about the understanding that a lot of countries have, where we hear the top line, which is they don't want to take sides between the various powers. And as you pointed out, in Nepal, we cannot make this only about the U.S. and China. Obviously, India plays a very important role. And you also wrote in the report that they don't follow the textbook strategies for hedging because there's the impact of domestic politics, there's regime survival, and all sorts of other factors. Let's start at the high level about how these 3 countries in particular are managing these rivalries and what we should take away from it.
What we are essentially bringing out in that paper is that, look, countries are, it's difficult to say countries are rational actors because, countries are only as rational as their, ruling establishments are rational, right? And it's like what you see in the US right now. Like you can't call US behaving rationally or irrationally. It's more like Trump and his coterie behaving rationally and irrationally, right? So that happens in smaller states too. You've got, the ruling elites have a particular interest. They would want to extend the legitimacy to rule as much as possible. And in that process, if China is a resource, if China's influence is useful, then they're more than happy to take it. And you see this in countries like Maldives. Maldives has periodically, election after election, either become very close to India or very close to China, right? And other states have sort of, in some ways, tried to balance it. But what we're arguing is this balancing act is really, really difficult because it's never, the foreign policy positions are never derived from a broad national sort of consensus-based sort of interest determination. These things happen, at the will of the ruling elites, and it can go in any direction, and that makes it all the more risky.
Yeah. Mandakini, Sagar gave us a really nice kind of setup for this. One of the things that we've seen is that in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, and in Bangladesh, and certainly in Nepal, there's been this flirtation with the major powers in the region, to varying levels of success. But again, talk to us about this question of the interests that Sagar brought up. Sometimes the ruling elite's interests are not necessarily aligned with those of the population or the foreign policy, and as such, they don't necessarily behave rationally. So if we want to look at how these countries are managing these rivalries, give us a little bit of your insights of what you found on the research.
Well, I think it's useful to think of it in sort of like an analogy, right? So I think as Sagar said that, geographically, South Asia is one geographic unit with the Himalayas as a natural boundary. And of course, you have the oceans. And historically, there have been, very civilizational, the Ashokas, through history, the Mughals, etc. And then the British who kind of knit it into one administrative unit. But that administrative unit fractured, right, during partition, and you had the creation of these different nation states. And I think we often forget how strongly that legacy of partition, both in terms of the division of land, of people, of resources, has truly affected the way in which states in the region actually see each other and are able to engage with one another. So it's kind of like when you divide land amongst if you were to divide land amongst, your 5 brothers of, 5 men and women. And it's been fundamentally unequal in some instances, right? Some geography was traded, some people got left behind on one side. And those wounds, I don't think, have ever really knitted. So the region has a baggage which it carries, which I think very often plays very emotionally into foreign policy decision making. And very often by the political parties in different countries in particular moments of either political upheaval or economic hardship play into decisions that they might take with respect to whether it's choosing a particular infrastructure project from India versus China or taking a particular line of credit or a particular loan. So what I'm trying to say is that engagement with India always comes with a certain degree of historical baggage, one of which also is what Sagar spoke about, this idea of it being a regional hegemon and behaving like a big brother. It's something that India has been accused of for decades, and I think justifiably so. But at the same time, it's like kind of like that big brother who you hate, but you love to hate. And we all know we love to hate him. But in a time of crisis, you know that big brother is the one that's going to come. So in the instance that during the COVID pandemic, when the whole world locked down, it was India that actually manufactured vaccines and was the first to provide them to a lot of countries in its neighborhood. It was very
until
often,
India shut. But to be fair, until India shut down its own vaccine manufacturing, that we in the rest of Asia could not get drugs from India. So there are limits to that. And that exposes the risks, though. So we in Vietnam were counting on India to provide vaccines to us. Now, the West hoarded all the vaccines for themselves. But when India made a decision in its own interest at the expense of everybody else, it exposed the asymmetries in these relationships. Can you speak a little bit to the imbalances that exist in these great power rivalries? When you're sitting in Nepal and you're relying on India, you're up to the whims of what happens in New Delhi, and that's it, like the vaccine during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're not just the vaccines, right? Like Sagar will speak about the 2015 blockade of the border between India and India instituted a blockade in Nepal, which had serious implications on its economy, on fuel access. And then it's actually very often, like I said, India's high-handedness in moments of crisis for other countries very often has also pushed them to seek alternative options, as they should, and I think would be a rational policy choice for any government in that moment, to diversify options. But I think what the paper is also showing is that those decisions sometimes are genuinely reflective of what the country needs at that point. Sometimes it's to do with just servicing the interests of the ruling political elite, for example, right? So, and that hedging sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't. That balancing works sometimes, but it doesn't. But I think the lesson, I think, for countries like India is that, also the geography and the South Asia has changed in the sense that, very often you're looking at a population of 2 billion people. The median age in India is in the region is 27. That means that's a young, very young population, all of whom are looking for jobs, all of whom have, social media, TikTok, not TikTok necessarily, we don't have it in India, but other countries do. And they're seeing a lifestyle which they all aspire to. So there's a lot of pressure on local governments, on countries in the region to provide for their young voting elites and middle class a lifestyle that they aspire to. And the question is, where is that going to come from? Where will the jobs come from? Where will the market come from? Where will the goods be sold? And India, unfortunately, has done a terrible job of opening up its markets to its neighbors. And so they will look for markets elsewhere. They will look to send their labor elsewhere because India, the region is famously called one of the least integrated regions in the world, right? So trade is very hard. Transit is really hard. Making a phone call is very hard. Getting visas is really hard. So unlike ASEAN, which is quite a really well functioning to some extent regional unit and, political bloc, mobility is really hard in South Asia. People can't even visit relatives across the border. So I'll pause there and I'll let Sagar weigh in as well if he wants to.
No, and what you're saying, I think, will resonate with a lot of people in Africa where mobility is also an issue and also a very young population that is looking to upgrade their lifestyles, and certainly against what they see in TikTok, but also just in absolute terms as well. Sagar, this question of the great powers, the U.S., China, and India, and as they're being perceived. When we were in Indonesia a couple of weeks ago, we met with some senior stakeholders, and they explained the relationship that they have with China as one where Indonesians don't look at China as an ally or a threat, but an opportunity. And what they said was, well, this is basically a conditional relationship. The moment it ceases to be an opportunity, they will look somewhere else for opportunities. How do you think the smaller powers in South Asia, especially in places like Nepal, look at the major powers, all three of the major powers, in that same way as Indonesia, or do they see it differently?
Well, it is more or less the same as Indonesia. And even when I, at the beginning of this conversation, I said China is an emergent actor here. And then it comes with all these goodies. It's an opportunity, right? But what the Chinese trajectory is of a kind that will probably not stop being an opportunity for some time to come, right? And that's largely because, how well it has established itself in the technology front, right? Like in the whole world, as some anticipation that, AI, for instance, would be, part of their economic engine, or a sort of a new window for innovation in all economies. But look at how AI is developing, right? If in the entire world, there is this particular space in the US, in Silicon Valley, where 7 companies have invested more than $1 trillion in that technology. And for that technology to become ever affordable, or for any other country to sort of think of coming up with their own AI ecosystems, is completely impossible from cost-wise, from talent-wise, and so on and so forth. So while, there is almost a preoccupation among the 7 giants as to who beats who, China is quietly putting ecosystems, the entire AI ecosystems, that's the hardware and the model, and lock, stock, and barrel, ready to be sold at much lower prices to any buyer in the global south, right? So that's what they did with the cell phone, industry. That's what they've done with the EV, right? So if you just look at these 2 products with which we already have prior experience, which is EV and cell phones, now think about if at a much lower cost, companies, governments, militaries across the world can buy, Chinese produced, almost, break the seal, open the package and start running kind of AI modules, right? So
yeah, at low cost too,
at
low power
absolutely
and low cost.
So there are opportunities like that, right? And even in terms of financing, right? So it's easy to say, we can live without the US, but the reality is, US's current annual budget is 1.5 times larger than the Indian economy, right? So you can't, you can't escape the influence that comes from that kind of money, right? So from that angle, and then, for most South Asian countries, India's market is why is EU in India today, right?
And Canada as well was there.
Canada as well, right? So they're in India, and that fact is not unnoticed by India's neighbors. Like, what about us, the little guys here, right? So from all of those considerations, I don't think China is at least not foreseeably going to weaken in terms of what goodies it has to offer, and from that angle, the balancing, edging, sort of thinking about what lies ahead in future, will continue to make geopolitical calculations difficult.
Yeah, Mandakini, the points that Sagar raised on AI and the goodies relate to oftentimes infrastructure, and infrastructure becomes a very important part of the dynamics of great power management in these parts of the world. The U.S. has sought to become a bigger player with its various initiatives that it's brought out over the years with the DFC and others to counter the Belt and Road. India is a big infrastructure builder in the small states that you guys covered in your report. And of course, China with its Belt and Road initiative, particularly in places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Talk to us about the importance of infrastructure as a vector of the great power competition in this part of the world.
No, I think infrastructure is a really big one. And of course, India cannot hope to compete with China in terms of the scale and the number of projects with the BRI, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, India is very concerned about things like CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, because that has a certain, and the border roads construction happening around India's northwest and western eastern frontier. But I think, look, when it comes to the small states that we looked at, obviously, whether, if you're a small island state like the Maldives, which is basically a bunch of island atolls, which are, very inaccessible, inaccessible either you have to be accessed by flight or by boat, right? So, infrastructure for them is a real need. And I think it's interesting to see how the Maldives has been very effective in kind of extracting infrastructure contracts or getting infrastructure investment from both China and India, and also by successive governments. So, a few years ago, the government of, I think it was Mohammed Yamin, had investment that he brought in from China. And then subsequently, the following prime minister president brought in investment from India. So I think also you have this flip-flop very often between competing opposition political parties where, one is openly pro-China. While they're in government, they'll bring in Chinese investment. Then the person in opposition will be like, no, China out, India in. And when they come into power, they bring India in. And of course, the recent president of the Maldives, came into power on a very anti-Indian stance. He wanted India's defense support to the Maldives. We had some troops stationed there for them to leave. He came into power, the troops left, and then the following year he came to India seeking investment, right? So also a lot of these decisions are politically expedient and are demonstrate a certain optics to your, to your domestic constituency, which is also important, right? Sovereignty is very important to small states, and the optics of being seen as being neutral, as being non-aligned, as being not pro one party or the other, or one power or the other, is actually strategically very important to them. So I think to the point around infrastructure, I just want to make one point, which is, I think it goes without saying that, if you go to Sri Lanka, for example, China has built the most amazing 4-lane highways, right? And the feedback from the ground is China comes in with its own, its own engineers, its own equipment, but they deliver the goods in record time, very efficiently, and it's built to last. Whereas sometimes India's own track record of delivering these large infrastructure projects is not as good on the ground because of bureaucratic inefficiencies or maybe, some issues in terms of contracting, etc. So I think India needs to do better if it hopes to compete with China, but it is, in many ways, it can't because of the scale, the sheer proficiency with which also China has been building roads and infrastructure around the world. Africa is a good example, right? I had a friend who was posted in Sierra Leone 6-lane highway in like a couple of months,
It's very impressive. I'd like to close our discussion looking forward a little bit. You wrote this report back in October of last year. And again, the world has changed dramatically since October. We see a breakdown of the international system and also of the institutions themselves. The United States has all but quit the United Nations. The United Nations is doing significant layoffs now of its staff. What does it mean for these kinds of countries when the institutions and the systems that have been in place for 70, 80 years are not there anymore? It's obviously a risk, but is it also an opportunity?
Yeah, so for the small states, it's a risk. It's a risk because the number one issue comes from, the small states as such couldn't or never did have much of a voice in actually, making these rules in the rules-based order, right? And so, but anything that promises to treat everybody equally is always good when you are a geopolitically weak actor, right? And so there is a natural leaning towards a rules-based system in small states. And that being shaken is a serious problem, right? Because now, the middle powers jostle, right? In the sense that when the Canadian Prime Minister spoke about it, it sounded good. But then there is internal competition between the middle powers. In the 1990s, both China and India were considered middle powers. China is in a different place today. That's a different story, right? So, but the India-China competition was felt by these smaller states, even them. And now you have, Europe coming in and so on and so forth. So there'll be a lot of jostling. And then the smaller states have all, a more heightened risk of being squished in one direction or the other. The third thing about the upheavals that we've seen is this whole jeopardy on development financing stream, right? So, America withdrew lock, stock, and barrel. Europe, because of its own war in the backyard and failing economies, and now that it has an issue with tariffs with US, its biggest trading partner, so on and so forth. The European outlook economically isn't good, and so whatever they were able to do through EU or at a bilateral level, particularly UK, Germany, France. France in Africa, others elsewhere, so on and so forth. That development financing stream is also in some ways being compromised. And then now the latest news is Japan is being shaky, right? I mean, Japanese bonds being as cheap as they were, borrowing from Japan was a great advantage for very many developing countries in Asia, where Japan has some degree of focus. India has borrowed heavily. Sri Lanka has borrowed heavily. Nepal has borrowed heavily. Bangladesh has borrowed heavily. That's because the interest rates were so low. Now the Japanese interest rates are growing very rapidly high, right? So because of all of these changes, it's like just because the dominoes started falling from the US, but it has sort of taken the whole world in a sweep. And so all of those development prospects, financing, and so on and so forth has become a problem for smaller states.
Mandakini, what do you think?
I think it's sort of like we all may have known that the rules of the game were not fair, but at least we knew what the rules were. I think now when you've thrown the rules out of the window, it is a situation of, it's an unknown situation of just not knowing what will happen, what you're going to wake up to and read in the papers tomorrow, right? And I think for any country, whether it is, for a large country like India, yes, certainly it's a concern. You never know whether the tariffs will go up or down tomorrow, what Trump will tweet about overnight. And I think for small states, the existential anxiety will probably be even more. And I think, one underestimates the power of a single vote in the UN, right? So even a small island state like Nauru or Kiribati or one small little island in the Caribbean, that vote really mattered in the UN. So if the devaluation of that UN vote, I think, is significant. Equally, the fact that, the UN has been passing all these resolutions on whether it's Ukraine or on Gaza, and none of them have been backed. So if a country like Ukraine or, a big political conflict like Gaza, no one is going to come. Essentially, the message is no one is coming to our rescue, right? And no one is listening. And I think that's very disconcerting. I think in terms of an opportunity, with this whole Monroe doctrine of America wanting to kind of withdraw and create its own sphere of influence in the West, that means it's going to create a vacuum, right? Now, who is going to fill that vacuum? Russia, China, India, to some extent it's a player, but not in the same way. It doesn't have that kind of military capability. But I would suspect that there's a lot of head scratching and thinking going on in countries in South Asia, whether they are small or big, about, who are our friends and who are our allies and who do we, what kind of new alignments do we need to be thinking about? I think we'll see the rise of more minilaterals or trilaterals, groups of 2 or 3 countries trying to come together. But as Sagar said, economics matters, and they will be looking at how do they shore up their economies so that you don't see the kind of domestic political upheaval you've seen in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, right? So it's going to be a very tough balancing act, and also maintaining your own strategic integrity as a country,
Yeah, and we also didn't touch on it, but there's going to be bottom-up pressure as well from Gen Z.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Sagar, we can talk about that at some other future time, but, Nepal was ground zero for one of the most violent uprisings of Gen Z that expressed their frustration. So these governments are going to be facing top-down pressure from the major powers and bottom-up pressure from this huge population of young people who want a better life. And we saw these same pressures in Nairobi and in Jakarta and in other parts of the world as well. Absolutely fascinating to start thinking about this because we're in a whole new world now. And it is, as you pointed out, maybe this is something that, many of these countries expected because they've seen the hypocrisies for so long, but actually talking about them now is so important given that it's being discussed in Berlin and London and Brussels and Washington, but it's not necessarily being discussed as much elsewhere. So we're happy that you both were able to join us. Mandakini Surie and Sagar Prasai are both independent development consultants who've been in this business for a very, very long time. They did some fascinating research on how small powers in South Asia, in are dealing with this new world that we're in. Now, again, they wrote it last year. The new world is even more new this year. And so we're happy that you were able to join us. Thank you both for taking your time today to share some of your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much.
And we want to thank everybody for joining us today for another episode of the show. We'll be back again next week with another edition. And we hope that in the meantime, you'll check out everything that the team at CGSP is doing around the world in French and Spanish and English. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com and you can get all of the coverage that really is the only place in the world that we're doing it at this level. So we hope that you'll give us a look and check us out. So for the entire team around the world, thank you so much for joining me today and for watching and for listening.